Okay, in this video, we're going to very quickly cover the processes of olfaction and gustation. So olfaction is our process of smelling. This is what allows us, our brain, to interpret the things that we smell. So olfaction is one of our chemical senses, along with gustation. The molecules that, or the chemicals that you smell are called odorants. And you have a special epithelium in your nasal cavity called the olfactory epithelium. And that is what we would call our sensory receptor organ. And within that organ, then we have olfactory receptor cells. These have little cilia or hair extensions on them that extend into the mucus. So these are the cells that are going to allow us to detect these chemicals called odorants. These are bipolar neurons, so they have one dendrite extension that sort of branches into these hairs that go into the mucus, and one axon. Now, what happens when the hair, the cilia or the hair on these special receptor cells binds to an odorant? It goes through a process, but ultimately, this causes some cation channels to open. When that happens, the cations, like sodium, calcium, are going to move into the cell, because remember, the inside of our neurons is more negative, right, than the outside. So when those channels are open, those positive ions are going to flow in, which changes the polarization of the cell, and this is what starts the graded potential. So ultimately, if there's enough, it can lead to a receptor potential, an action potential that will travel through the olfactory nerve, or cranial nerve 1, to the brain. The part of the brain that's going to receive this information and process it is our temporal lobe. And I also want to point out, and I'll show you on the image in the next slide, that there are some little holes in a specific bone that makes up your nasal cavity called the ethmoid bone. And there's an area of this called the cribriform plate that you'll see that these nerves are extending to become, right, the olfactory nerve that goes to the brain through these holes in this specific bone. Okay, so let's take a look. We have these odorant molecules that are coming from the rose. Okay, let me get my pen on. And one thing I want to point out is that the sensory receptors for olfaction are actually in the superior part of the nasal cavity. And remember that these hair cells are in the mucus. So the odorants are going to have to get dissolved in the mucus in order for these hair cells, right, to detect these odorants. So let's take a look right here. We're going to look at this blown up, okay, in this image below. But that's where the olfactory epithelium is going to be located in the nasal passage. And so as we see, we have this layer right here, right, is our olfactory epithelium. And we see that we have basal cells there to provide what's needed for these olfactory receptor cells. But our focus really is on these receptor cells, okay, that are shown in yellow. And you see the dendrites, or the extensions, right, off the dendrite into the mucus layer. So that's where the odor molecules must get absorbed into the mucus layer, right, in order for those hair cells to detect those molecules. Now, let me clear this off. Change colors a little bit. We can see that the axons from the hair cells, right, are continuing through what I mentioned, this bone right here that has the cribriform plate. This is the ethmoid bone. That's an M. Ethmoid bone that's helping to make up part of our nasal passage. So those axons are going to extend through those small openings, right? And they will join, and that is what is eventually going to become our cranial nerve 1 that will travel to the brain. Now, it's going to, as I mentioned, the temporal lobe, okay, is what's going to process and help us to understand what we're smelling. But we also know when we talked about the brain that our sense of olfaction and our olfactory nerves are part of, too, what helps our limbic system. So that's why sometimes when you have a smell, it will trigger a memory. It could be positive or negative, but that's related to our limbic system and our sort of emotional memory. So now we'll switch gears to another chemical receptor, which is in our process of gustation. So this is what allows us to taste the food we eat. And in olfaction, our chemical molecules were odorants. In gustation, they're called tastants. So it's still a chemical sense, right? Our sensory receptor cells are called gustatory cells. And I want to point out, so we have papillae on our tongue, okay? Now, these papillae are not the same thing as taste buds. The papillae are projections of connective tissue and epithelial tissue, but they contain taste buds. So they're not one and the same, right? In other words, the taste buds are located on these projections, on these papillae. And there are 3 different types of papillae that I want us to just briefly discuss. Okay, these 3 right here. So we have fungiform, and we'll look at an image, but these are going to be found on the tip or the anterior part of the tongue and the sides. The foliate are going to be on the lateral, so the posterior lateral, these kind of ridges, but these don't last into adulthood. We only find these present as infants and through childhood. So the majority of our taste buds are going to be found in these papillae called valate or circumvallate. These form a V shape on the posterior part of the tongue, sort of an inverted V. I'll show you a picture of that. So I just want to reiterate that the papillae are not the same thing as the taste buds. Those are the projections of epithelial and connective tissue, and the taste buds then are found embedded or as part of those papillae. Now, so far with our special senses, we've had one specific cranial nerve that was responsible for sending those signals to the brain. But in taste, we actually have 2. So cranial nerve 7, which is our facial nerve, this is going to carry information from the front or the anterior 2/3 part of the tongue. Our cranial nerve 9, or the glossopharyngeal nerve, is going to carry that taste or gustatory information from the back 1/3 of the tongue. So we have 2 cranial nerves involved in gustation. So here's our tongue. I mentioned to you there were 3 papillae that contain taste buds. So remember, the taste bud is not the same as the papilla. The taste bud is found associated with or embedded in that papilla. So the fungiform, right, these are going to be in the anterior part. The foliate are those that are found on the ridges just when we're infants and children. And then it's the valate or the circumvallate that are these. So this looks a little bit more like a U, but sometimes it's drawn as sort of an inverted V. And these are going to be where the majority of our taste buds are located. Now, we have 5 different taste sensations that can be activated, or taste buds that can be activated for these different types of taste. So sweet taste is going to be activated by the tastants are going to be sugar molecules or even artificial sweeteners, right, that are made to activate those particular taste buds. Our salty taste sensation is when metal ions, so like salt, right? You put salt on something, we associate that with a salty taste. Table salt is made of sodium chloride, so it's those metal ions. If you get the other type of salt, it'll have potassium. I'm trying to think of the name of it right now. Sea salt. It will have potassium instead of sodium, or it might have both. Our sour taste comes from acids. So remember, acids increase the amount of H plus ions, or they cause excess H plus ions. So if you think about the way vinegar tastes, right, that's because vinegar is an acid. It has that sour taste. So we have a bitter taste sensation. So caffeine would be an example of that, or unsweetened chocolate. And then our savory taste is what's called umami. So you might associate that with eating meat. We have MSG that sort of causes that taste to be activated by our taste buds. It's really because of the presence of particular amino acids that are binding as those taste molecules.